September 1854. The British army that lands on the Crimean Peninsula is a museum piece. It is a force frozen in amber, preserved in the glory of Waterloo nearly 40 years prior. To the observer, it is magnificent. The ranks of redcoats are immaculate, the pipe-clayed belts are bright white, and the drill is executed with geometric precision. But this visual splendor hides a fatal rot. This is an army led by ghosts. Its commander, Lord Raglan, is a man who lost an arm fitting beside Wellington and hasn't commanded a substantial force in decades. He is so stuck in the past that he frequently refers to the enemy as the French, forgetting that the French are now his allies, standing right beside him. The strategic reality of 1854 is brutal. The British and French empires have joined forces to prop up the crumbling Ottoman Empire against Russian expansion. Their objective is the Russian naval base at Sevastopol, the home of the Black Sea Fleet. The plan is simple, perhaps too simple. Land north of the city at Calamita Bay, march south along the coast and smash the Russian stronghold. There is no subtle maneuvering here. It is a direct, linear invasion. But as the Allied army of 60,000 men begins its march south, the enemy is not just the Russians. It is the environment. The British Commissariat, the department responsible for logistics, has failed before the first shot is fired. There are almost no ambulances, few wagons, and insufficient tents. Men are sleeping in the open rain. Worse still is the cholera. It stalks the marching columns like a spectre. Men drop out of the ranks, writhing in agony, left to die by the roadside as the grand procession moves on. This is the context that is often forgotten. The army that approaches the river Alma is already sick, thirsty, and poorly led. Waiting for them is Prince Menshikov, the commander of the Russian forces in the Crimea. Menshikov is a man of supreme arrogance. He has chosen his ground carefully, establishing a defensive line on the high bluffs south of the river Alma. He writes to the Tsar, boasting that he can hold this position for 3 weeks. His plan is not necessarily to destroy the Allies here, but to stop them cold. He believes the terrain is his greatest weapon. The north bank, where the Allies must approach, is a gentle slope cluttered with vineyards and villages, perfect for breaking up the rigid formations of the attackers. The south bank, where the Russians wait, is a fortress of nature, steep cliffs near the sea, rising to rolling hills inland. Menshikov has roughly 39,000 men and over 100 guns. He has massed the bulk of his artillery on the Kurgan Hill, a dominant feature in the center right of his line. He has constructed a large earthwork there, the Great Redoubt, bristling with heavy 12 and 32-pounder cannons. This is the killing ground. Menshikov is so confident in the natural strength of his left flank, the cliffs near the sea, that he leaves them lightly defended, believing them impassable to any organized body of troops. This assumption will be the first domino to fall. On the morning of September 20th, the Allied armies crest the final ridge and look down into the valley of the Alma. It is a spectacle of 19th century warfare. On the right, next to the sea, are the French. They look modern. Their troops, including the elite zouaves in their baggy trousers and turbans, move with a professional, loose-limbed efficiency. They carry their own shelter tents and cook their own food. In the center and on the left are the British. They look stiff, formed in long, rigid lines of red, dying of thirst and heatstroke under their heavy shakos. Lord Raglan and Marshal Saint-Arnaud, the French commander, meet to finalize the plan. Or rather, the lack of one. Saint-Arnaud, who is literally dying of stomach cancer as he sits on his horse, proposes a bold flanking maneuver. His division under General Bosquet will scale those impassable cliffs by the sea, turning the Russian left. Raglan, in his typical passive style, agrees to let the French make the first move. The British role is less imaginative. They are to wait for the French to turn the flank and then launch a frontal assault against the main Russian position on the Kurgan Hill. It is a plan that relies entirely on the bravery of the infantry, for there is almost no tactical finesse in sending men straight into the mouth of a fortified battery. The battle begins not with a roar, but with a climb. At around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, General Bosquet initiates the French attack on the Allied right. This is the moment where the difference in military philosophy becomes stark. While the British are still dressing their lines in the valley, the French are moving with the agility of mountain goats. Bosquet's division, led by the Zouaves, troops recruited from French settlers in Algeria, tough and fiercely independent, approaches the mouth of the Alma near the sea. They find a sandbar that allows them to cross the river without getting their powder wet, a crucial detail in the age of paper cartridges. Facing them are the cliffs Menshikov deems secure. They are steep, rugged, and seemingly impassable for artillery. But the French are determined. In a feat of engineering and brute strength that stuns the Russian observers on the heights, the Zouaves begin to scramble up the goat paths. They don't just carry their rifles, they drag 12 field guns up these narrow tracks. It is an arduous, lung-bursting ascent, but within an hour the unthinkable happens. French skirmishers appear on the plateau, the highest ground of the entire battlefield. They are now flanking the Russian left, looking down along the entire enemy line. For Prince Menshikov, this is a splash of cold water. He is miles away, watching from the Kourgain hill, when reports arrive that the French are establishing a foothold on his impassable flank. His arrogance instantly transforms into panic. The static defense he has prepared is unraveling before a single British soldier has fired a shot. He is forced to react, and his reaction is clumsy. He detaches 7 battalions of infantry and 2 batteries of artillery from his centre and marches them toward the sea to contain Bosquet. This is a critical moment. The Russian centre, facing the British, is being stripped of its reserves. The door is creaking open for Lord Raglan, but Raglan does not kick it down. Not yet. The British commander is watching the French progress, or lack thereof. Bosquet has made the heights, but he is now isolated. The Russians are bringing heavy columns to bear on his precarious position, and without support, the French could be pushed back into the sea. Saint-Arnaud sends a desperate message to Raglan, essentially asking, "Where are the British?" The plan relies on simultaneous pressure, but the British army is stationary. For the men in the British ranks, this delay is agonizing. They have marched into range of the Russian guns on the Kourgain hill and the Telegraph height, but they have not been given the order to advance. The Russian gunners, seeing these distinct red lines standing perfectly still in the open, begin to find their range. Round-shot, solid iron balls start ploughing through the British files. A single ball can take off 3 heads in a row or shatter the legs of 4 men. To mitigate the slaughter, the British officers order their men to lie down in the tall grass and the vineyards. It is a surreal scene. Thousands of men lying flat, enduring a bombardment they cannot return, while the sun beats down and the cholera cramps continue to torment them. They watch the white puffs of smoke from the Russian batteries, count the seconds, and wait to see where the Iron Death will land. This passive endurance is a hallmark of the British soldier, a discipline drilled into them by the lash, but it is testing their morale to the breaking point. They can hear the rattle of musketry on the right where the French are fighting, but in their sector there is only the thud of cannonballs hitting the earth and the screams of the unlucky. Menshikov, seeing the British finally beginning to stir, plays his next card. He orders his men to set fire to the village of Bourliuk, which sits directly in front of the British centre on the north bank of the river. The wooden houses, dry as tinder from the summer heat, catch instantly. A wall of flame and black, choking smoke erupts, blocking the direct path to the river. This is a tactical nuisance of the highest order. It acts as a breakwater. The British 2nd Division, under General de Lacy Evans, which was aligned to march straight through the village, is forced to split. Regiments have to jostle and shove to get around the inferno, compressing the line and destroying the carefully maintained formation. The British army is no longer a neat machine. It is becoming a mob, funneling into the gaps between the fire and the flanks, blindly stumbling toward the riverbank where the Russian skirmishers are waiting. The focus now shifts to the Light Division on the Allied left. If the burning village was a disruption, the terrain they are about to traverse is a nightmare for a 19th century army obsessed with linear perfection. Between the British position and the River Alma lies a belt of walled vineyards and gardens. These are not open fields. They are a maze of stone walls, trellis work, and deep, entangling vegetation. For a skirmisher fighting independently, this is excellent cover. For a regiment trying to maintain a solid two-deep line, it is a disaster. Sir George Brown, the commander of the Light Division, is a man who seemingly stepped out of a time machine from 1809. He is brave to the point of folly, but he is notoriously short-sighted. Literally, he refuses to wear spectacles in battle, and rigid in his adherence to the regulations. As the order is finally given to advance, the Light Division marches into the vineyards. Immediately, the cohesion vanishes. Soldiers have to scramble over stone walls, breaking their ranks. They trip over vines, crushing the grapes underfoot until their boots are stained purple. A grim foreshadowing of the blood to come. The carefully dressed lines dissolve into a confused swarm of individuals, all pushing forward, officers shouting to restore order in a chaotic environment where their voices are lost. As they emerge from the vineyards, they face the river. The Alma is not a mighty waterway, but at this specific point, the banks are steep, in some places rising 8 or 10 feet sheer from the water. The men slide down the mud, plunging into the stream, which varies from knee-deep to chest-high. They hold their rifles and ammunition pouches above their heads, struggling for footing on the slippery riverbed. All the while, Russian sharpshooters on the opposite bank are firing directly into this mass of struggling humanity. The water turns red. The men who scramble up the far bank are not the precise military machine that paraded in London. They are a soaking wet, breathless, disorganized mob. Regiments are mixed together. A soldier from the 7th Fusiliers might find himself standing next to a man from the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers. In a textbook battle, the officers would halt the advance here, redress the lines, verify the alignment, and then move forward. But there is no time. They are now standing on the dead ground at the foot of the Crimean hill, directly beneath the Great Redoubt. Above them, the Russian gunners depress their barrels. They switch from round shot to canister, tins filled with musket balls that turn cannons into giant shotguns. The range is less than 300 yards. When the guns fire, the effect is catastrophic. The hail of lead tears through the huddled British troops on the riverbank, flaying the crowd. To stay here is suicide. To retreat is unthinkable. There is only one direction that offers a chance of survival. Forward, into the smoke. Sir George Brown, mounted on his grey horse, is conspicuous among the infantry. He waves his sword and spurs his horse up the slope. He gives no complex tactical manoeuvring orders, because none are possible. He simply leads the rush. This is not a charge in the romantic sense. There is no steady drumbeat, no synchronized step. It is a desperate, scrambling ascent up a grassy slope slick with blood. The British soldiers, driven by adrenaline and the terrified realization that the only way to stop the cannon fire is to kill the gunners, begin to surge up the hill. This movement is arguably the most critical moment of the early battle. It is entirely unplanned. The Light Division, intended to be the skirmishing force that screens the main attack, has become the main attack. They are attacking the strongest point of the Russian line, the Great Redoubt with its heavy guns and massed infantry support, virtually alone. They have outpaced their support. The Duke of Cambridge's 1st Division, comprised of the Guards and Highlanders, is still making its way through the vineyards behind them, slowed by the same obstacles and a more cautious command style. The Light Division is unsupported, outnumbered, and out of formation, yet they are climbing the hill with a ferocity that stuns the Russian defenders. On the Russian side, the infantry regiments, the Kazan and the Vladimir, are drawn up in massive, dense columns. This is the standard Russian doctrine: weight of numbers to crush the thin enemy lines. But as the British scramble up, stopping occasionally to catch their breath and fire, a new sound is heard on the battlefield. It is the sharp, whip-crack report of the mini rifle. The British infantry, even in their disorder, are armed with a weapon far superior to the Russian smoothbore muskets. They can hit a man at 600 yards. The Russians struggle to hit anything at 100. As the British climb, they begin to pick off the Russian gunners and the officers leading the columns. The impossible assault is gaining traction, driven by superior technology and the sheer desperation of the men on the slope. The final 50 yards to the Great Redoubt are a blur of violence. The British soldiers, lungs burning, their uniforms torn by briars and blackened by powder, throw themselves over the parapet of the Russian earthwork. What they find inside is a scene of frantic activity. The Russians, adhering to a strict doctrine that prioritizes the safety of their artillery above all else, are desperately trying to hitch horses to their cannons to drag them away. They have managed to save most of their heavy guns, but in the chaos, they are forced to abandon a brass howitzer. Captain Bell of the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers, in a moment of reckless bravery, breaks from the line, runs to the gun, and captures it single-handedly. For a fleeting moment, the Light Division has achieved the impossible. A disorganized mob has stormed a fortified position held by a superior force and driven them out. A cheer goes up, a ragged, breathless roar of triumph that echoes across the valley. They stand inside the redoubt, masters of the Corgain Hill. But as the smoke clears slightly, the reality of their situation becomes terrifyingly clear. They are alone. The Light Division is a victim of its own success. They have advanced so quickly that the support waves, the Guards and the Highlanders, are still struggling through the vineyards and the river below. Inside the redoubt, there is no order. Officers scream for the men to reform, to create a defensive line, but the units are hopelessly intermingled. A private from the 19th Regiment stands beside a sergeant from the Connaught Rangers. There is no cohesion, only a mass of red coats milling about in the captured earthwork. They are a mob, not an army, and they are dangerously exposed. Emerging from the grey mist further up the slope comes the Russian counterstroke. It is the Vladimir Regiment, one of the Tsar's finest units. They do not advance in a line, they move in a massive monolithic column, thousands of men packed shoulder to shoulder, bayonets fixed. To the exhausted British survivors in the redoubt, the Vladimir column looks like a rolling wall of grey stone. It is a terrifying sight, a manifestation of the sheer manpower of the Russian Empire coming to crush the few hundred men who have dared to take their hill. And then, the fog of war descends with tragic consequences. As the British soldiers raise their rifles to fire into this dense Russian mass, a target they could hardly miss, a voice rings out. It is an officer, perhaps confused by the grey greatcoats of the Russians, which look similar to the blue-grey coats of the French, or perhaps simply panicking. He shouts, "Do not fire! They are the French!" The order is repeated down the line. A bugler, nameless to history, sounds the ceasefire. The British muskets lower. The men hesitate. In that fatal pause, the Vladimir Regiment closes the distance. They stop, level their muskets, and unleash a devastating volley into the confused British mass. The impact is physical. The front ranks of the Light Division are swept away. The survivors, realizing their mistake too late, try to return fire, but the momentum has shifted. The psychological weight of the Russian column pressing down on them, combined with the lack of support and the confusion of orders, breaks their resolve. The retreat begins as a trickle and turns into a flood. The men who had stormed the heights with such bravery now turn and run. They tumble back over the parapet, sliding down the grassy slope they just climbed. It is a rout. The Great Redoubt is abandoned. The Russian gunners, seeing the British flee, rush back to their positions and recrew the guns that hadn't been dragged away. They begin to pour fire into the backs of the retreating British troop. The disaster is compounded at the river. As the remnants of the Light Division stream down the hill in panic, They collide head-on with the reinforcements finally making their way up. The Scots Fusilier Guards, the centre regiment of the Guards Division, has just crossed the river and is trying to form its line. Suddenly, they are hit by a wave of terrified men from the Light Division, breaking through their ranks, shouting, "The Russians are coming! It's a massacre!" The formation of the Scots Guards is shattered physically and morally before they can even engage the enemy. For a moment, it looks as if the entire British centre is about to collapse into a chaotic, stampeding ruin. The battle hangs by a thread. The Light Division is broken, the centre is in disarray, and the Russian columns are advancing to sweep the invaders back into the Alma. It is at this precise moment of crisis that the discipline of the old army asserts itself. The Scots Fusilier Guards, shaken by the collision with the retreating Light Division and drilled by Russian fire, begin to waver. A confused order to retire is shouted, intended for the Light Division remnants, but heard by the Guards. The regiment begins to fall back. The centre of the British line is now a gaping hole. If the Russians push their columns into this void, the army will be split in two. But on either side of the faltering Scots stand the two other regiments of the Guards Division, the Grenadier Guards on the right and the Coldstream Guards on the left. They are the epitome of military stoicism. They see the chaos unfolding in the centre, the retreating friends and the advancing enemy, and they do not flinch. Instead of breaking, they perform a maneuver that is as simple as it is difficult to execute under fire. They open their files to let the panicked survivors of the Light Division pass through, and then, like a steel gate slamming shut, they close ranks again. The line is restored. The panic is contained. To the left of the Guards, an even more formidable force is entering the fight. This is the Highland Brigade, commanded by Sir Colin Campbell. Campbell is the antithesis of the aristocratic amateurs like Raglan. He is a soldier's soldier, a veteran who has fought his way up from the bottom, and he understands the psychology of men in battle better than anyone on the field. As he brings his three regiments, the 42nd Black Watch, the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders, and the 79th Cameron Highlanders, up the slope from the river, he sees the Guards struggling. A staff officer, panicked by the retreat of the Light Division, rides up to Campbell and suggests that the Highlanders should be held back in reserve to cover the potential retreat. Campbell's response is legendary in its disdain for defeatism. He ignores the suggestion and turns to his men. He knows that the only way to stop the rot is to project absolute, unshakable confidence. He rides along the front of the 42nd, his face calm, his voice steady. He tells them there will be no firing until they are within close range, and then they will press home with the bayonet. "Forward, 42nd, he commands, and the bagpipes begin to scream. The advance of the Guards and Highlanders is the turning point of the Battle of the Alma. Unlike the frantic, breathless rush of the Light Division, this is a parade ground maneuver executed in the face of death. The men do not run, they walk. They march in a long, thin, two-deep line that stretches across the hillside. To the Russians, waiting in their dense columns on the heights, this formation looks absurdly fragile. They are used to fighting mass with mass. They cannot understand how a line so thin can hope to stop a column so deep. But the thin red line is a deceptive beast. By fighting in a line, every single British soldier can use his rifle. In the Russian columns, only the first two ranks can fire. The thousands of men behind them are useless weight, serving only to absorb bullets. As the British line closes the distance, the geometric superiority of their formation becomes lethal. The engagement that follows is a brutal mathematics lesson. The Grenadiers and Coldstreams on the right and the Highlanders on the left halt at optimal range. The officers give the command. The levelled rifles ripple with fire. A volley of mini-balls, heavy lead projectiles expanding to grip the rifling, slams into the Russian columns. The effect is horrifying. The bullets pass through the first man, the second man, sometimes even the third. The front faces of the Vladimir and Kazan columns are simply erased. The Russians try to return fire, but their smoothbore muskets are hopelessly outranged. They are fighting an enemy they can barely hit, while they themselves are being dismantled, row by row. The Russian officers, brave to the end, try to urge their men forward with the bayonet, believing that if they can just close the distance, their superior numbers will crush the British line. But they cannot close the distance. The wall of fire is too intense. The British load, aim and fire with a rhythmic, mechanical efficiency that is relentless. Campbell, sensing the moment, keeps the pressure on. He manoeuvres his Highland regiments in an echelon formation, a staircase arrangement, where each regiment steps off slightly behind and to the left of the one before it. This allows him to flank the Russian right, wrapping around their formation like a constrictor snake. The 93rd crests the hill, followed by the 79th. The Russians look to their flank and see yet more of these devils in skirts, appearing out of the smoke, pouring fire into their exposed sides. The Russian soldiers, brave as they are not automatons. They are men, and they have reached the limit of human endurance. The columns begin to waver. The great grey mass, which had looked so unstoppable minutes ago, begins to shudder and loosen. The will to fight is evaporating under the relentless, disciplined hammering of the British line. The tipping point arrives not with a grand strategic manoeuvre, but with a simple failure of morale. The Russian soldier is famous for his stubbornness, his capacity to endure punishment that would break other armies. But on the Crimean hill, he is facing a mathematical impossibility. He cannot fight back. The psychological strain of being slaughtered by an enemy who remains effectively out of range becomes too much. The swaying of the columns turns into a backward surge. It starts at the rear, men edging away from the slaughter, and ripples forward. Suddenly the discipline snaps. The massive Vladimir and Kazan regiments, the pillars of Menshikoff's defense, dissolve. They do not break in a wild, screaming panic like the Light Division did earlier. Rather, they disintegrate into a sullen, confused mass of individuals seeking safety. The officers, shouting and striking their men with the flats of their swords, are swept away by the tide. The greycoats stream back over the crest of the hill, abandoning the Great Redoubt and the Crimean Hill to the British. To accelerate this collapse, the British finally bring their own artillery into the fight in a decisive manner. 2 9-pounder guns from Turner's battery are manhandled up the slopes, bumping over the rough ground and the bodies of the fallen. They are unlimbered on a small knoll that offers a perfect firing line into the flank of the retreating Russians. The gunners load with shrapnel and round shot and open fire. The effect on the retreating crowds is devastating. The shots plough through the disorganized masses, turning the retreat into a full-blown rout. The Russians are no longer an army, they are a target. As the smoke begins to drift away on the afternoon breeze, the British troops stand victorious on the heights. The scene before them is gruesome testimony to the power of the mini rifle. The slopes of the Crimean Hill are carpeted with Russian dead and wounded. In some places where the columns had stood firmest, the bodies are piled 3 or 4 deep, lying in swathes that mark exactly where the volleys struck home. It is a slaughterhouse. The British have fired thousands of rounds, and nearly every bullet seems to have found a mark in the dense Russian formations. Lord Raglan rides up to the high ground, surrounded by his staff. For the first time in the battle, he is truly the master of the field. The British troops, seeing their commander, raise a cheer that travels down the line, from the Highlanders on the far left to the Guards in the centre. Caps are thrown into the air. It is a moment of intense catharsis. They have endured the cholera, the march, the heat, the artillery bombardment, and the terrifying climb into the Callan's mouth, and they have won. They have driven the Tsar's army from a position boasted to be impregnable. But the victory is incomplete. The Russian army is beaten, broken, and fleeing south towards Sevastopol, but it is not destroyed. This is the critical moment where a great general would unleash the cavalry. The British Light Brigade and Heavy Brigade, commanded by Lord Lucan, are sitting fresh and unengaged on the British left flank. They are watching the disorganized Russian mob stream away across the plateau. It is the dream target for a cavalry commander. A broken infantry force with no formation and no morale. A charge now would turn the defeat into a total annihilation. It could effectively end the war in an afternoon by capturing the Russian guns, baggage, and perhaps even Prince Menshikov himself. The British cavalry troopers grip their sabres, expecting the order at any second. Lord Lucan looks to Raglan. Raglan looks to the French. But the order never comes. The moment of potential total victory hangs in the air, shimmering like a mirage, before it begins to fade. The reasons for this inaction are complex and controversial, rooting in the fragile politics of the alliance and the peculiar lethargy that seems to grip the Allied High Command whenever the immediate danger has passed. The friction of coalition warfare now asserts itself with frustrating consequences. Lord Raglan, despite his passive command style during the heat of the fight, recognizes the magnitude of the opportunity before him. He proposes an immediate pursuit. He wants to unleash the cavalry and horse artillery to chase the broken Russians, turning their retreat into a catastrophe. He knows that a defeated army is at its most vulnerable when it is running away. But he cannot act alone. He rides to meet Marshal Saint-Arnaud to coordinate the coup de grâce. The French commander refuses. The reasons given are logistical and physical. The French troops, Saint-Arnaud argues, are exhausted. To scale the cliffs swiftly, they had left their heavy knapsacks on the banks of the Alma. They cannot advance further without retrieving their kit. Furthermore, their artillery has expended most of its ammunition. In short, the French are done for the day. Saint-Arnaud tells Raglan that the Russians should be allowed to build a golden bridge for their retreat, a military maxim suggesting one should leave a fleeing enemy a clear path to escape, lest they fight to the death when cornered. Raglan is placed in a difficult position. He commands the British forces, but he is acutely aware that the alliance is the priority. If he sends the British cavalry forward alone, he risks isolating his force and offending his French allies. And so, the disciple of Wellington bows to the pressure. He orders the cavalry to stand down. Lord Lucan, fuming, watches the Russians disappear over the horizon. The prisoners taken later would confirm the British error. They admitted that had the cavalry charged, the entire Russian army would have surrendered. Instead, Menshikov's battered forces are allowed to limp back to the safety of Sevastopol's fortifications, there to lick their wounds and prepare for a siege that will last a year. As the sun sets on the 20th of September, the adrenaline fades, replaced by the grim administrative reality of a 19th century battlefield. The butcher's bill is tallied. The British have lost roughly 2,000 men killed and wounded. The French claim fewer than 6,000 casualties, though their numbers are likely inflated to match their allies, while the Russians have left nearly 6,000 men on the field. The scene on the slopes of the Kourgan Hill is one of Dantesque horror. There is no organised ambulance corps. The British medical services are woefully inadequate, a fact that will soon become a national scandal. Wounded men are carried off the field on greatcoats slung between muskets or simply dragged. They are laid out in the vineyards and farmyards, row upon row of shattered bodies, waiting for surgeons who are already overwhelmed. Amputations are performed on kitchen tables, often without chloroform. The screams of the dying mingle with the cries of the thirst-maddened wounded who have not yet been collected. The victory, so sharp and brilliant in the tactical sense, begins to sour in the strategic aftermath. The British Army has won the ground, but it has not won the war. It remains an army without transport, without sufficient medical supplies, and now, without the momentum to finish the job. They camp on the battlefield for 2 days, burying the dead and loading the wounded onto ships. This delay, born of necessity and caution, gives the Russians precious time to strengthen the defences of Sevastopol. The window for a quick, decisive knockout blow has closed. The old army has won its first battle, but the seeds of its ultimate destruction, not by the enemy, but by logistical incompetence and disease, are already sown in the bloody vineyards of the Alma. The Battle of the Alma stands as a peculiar milestone in military history. It is a conflict that looks backward to the Napoleonic Wars and forward to the industrial slaughter of the 20th century simultaneously. Tactically, it was a vindication of the British system. The Thin Red Line, a formation often mocked by continental powers as too fragile, proved its superiority over the dense column. It demonstrated that firepower, delivered with discipline and precision, was the new master of the battlefield. The Russian belief in shock tactics, the idea that a mass of shouting men with bayonets could overawe a disciplined firing line, died on the slopes of the Kourgan hill. The Minié rifle had changed the geometry of war, extending the killing zone from 100 yards to half a mile. However, the battle also exposed the deep systemic rot within the British command structure. The victory was not won by the generals. Lord Raglan's contribution was primarily his physical courage. His tactical control was virtually non-existent. He allowed his divisions to attack disjointedly. He lost control of his skirmishers, and he failed to coordinate with his allies. The battle was won by the regimental officers, the sergeants, and the private soldiers who, when the plan fell apart, simply kept walking forward and firing. It was a victory of the regimental system, the intense tribal loyalty of the British units over the incompetence of the staff. In the wider context of the Crimean War, the Alma is the hook that draws the Allies in. It gave the British public a glorious victory to celebrate, blinding them temporarily to the logistical nightmare unfolding in the east. It convinced the commanders that the Russians could be beaten easily, leading to a dangerous overconfidence. This hubris would lead them to march around Sevastopol rather than attacking it immediately from the north, a fateful decision that would condemn the army to the freezing misery of the Chersonese upland. As the British army finally resumes its march south, leaving the graves of the Alma behind, they are walking into a trap of their own making. The old army of Wellington, magnificent in its drill and uniforms, is marching toward its doom. It will not be destroyed in battle. It will be destroyed by the winter, by starvation, and by the very bureaucracy that sent it there. The Alma was its last great parade, a final flash of scarlet glory before the mud and the grey misery of the siege set in. The Battle of the Alma was a tactical triumph and a strategic failure. It proved that the British soldier was still the toughest in Europe, but it also proved that the British Army was an institution in desperate need of reform. It was a battle where the courage of the common man overcame the stupidity of his leaders, a theme that would echo through the valley of Balaclava and the fog of Inkerman in the months to come. The Redcoats had taken the heights, but the long, cold descent had only just begun. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.